the warm desert wind carries whispers across millennia, rustling through the remnants of what once stood as the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. In the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization first drew breath from the rich alluvial soil, there rose a metropolis so magnificent that its very name became synonymous with power, luxury, and divine ambition. Babylon stretched beneath the Mesopotamian sun like a jewel cast upon the earth, its towers reaching toward the heavens, while its foundations anchored deep into the sacred ground that had nurtured humanity's earliest dreams. The year 605 BCE marked the ascension of a ruler whose vision would transform this ancient city into something beyond mortal comprehension. Nebuchadnezzar II, whose name meant Nabu, protect the crown, inherited not merely a throne, but a divine mandate to glorify his realm. Under his steady hand, Babylon would grow to encompass wonders that challenged the very boundaries between the earthly and the celestial, between human achievement and godlike creation. The king gazed out from his palace windows each dawn, watching the sun rise over a domain that pulsed with the rhythm of countless lives, all bound together in the grand symphony of empire. The city's heartbeat echoed through streets paved with fired brick and lined with buildings that seemed to glow like burnished gold in the morning light. Merchants from distant lands walked these thoroughfares carrying precious cargo, silken fabrics from the east, aromatic spices that perfumed the air with exotic promise, gleaming metals that caught and reflected the desert sun in brilliant flashes. The sounds of commerce blended with the soft prayers of priests tending their sacred fires, creating a constant, gentle murmur that spoke of prosperity and peace. Children played in shadowed courtyards, while their mothers drew water from wells that had sustained life in this place for countless generations. Yet it was the city's defenses that first proclaimed Babylon's might to any who approached from the surrounding plains. The massive walls rose from the earth like the shoulders of sleeping giants, their surfaces crafted from millions of baked bricks that had been shaped by skilled hands and fired in furnaces that burned day and night for months. These walls stretched for miles in an unbroken circuit around the city, their height so tremendous that 2 4-horse chariots could race abreast along their summit, while guards in bronze armor walked their eternal patrol. The walls were not merely fortification, but testament, a declaration written in clay and mortar that here dwelt a people who would not bow to any earthly power. Along the wall's face, glazed tiles caught the light in patterns that told stories of gods and kings, of hunting expeditions and sacred ceremonies. Deep blue backgrounds held images of striding lions and mighty dragons, their forms outlined in yellow and white that seemed to shimmer in the heat. Each tile had been crafted with meticulous care, fired at precisely the right temperature to achieve that perfect, lustrous finish that would endure for millennia. The Ishtar Gate, the most magnificent of the city's 8 entrances, rose like a mountain of blue-glazed brick adorned with golden animals that seemed to move in the shifting desert light. Within these protective walls lay wonders that transcended the imagination of visiting dignitaries and common citizens alike. The hanging gardens, suspended like a dream made manifest, cascaded in terraced splendor from the heights of the royal palace down toward the river's edge. These gardens were not merely planted, but architected, their every level carefully planned to create vistas of breathtaking beauty that changed with each season and hour of the day. Palm trees swayed gently above beds of roses whose fragrance drifted on warm breezes, while vines heavy with grapes and pomegranates created natural arbors where peacocks strutted in displays of iridescent magnificence. Water flowed through this aerial paradise in channels carved from stone and lined with lead, creating streams that bubbled and whispered as they descended from level to level. The engineering required to lift water to such heights demanded innovations in hydraulics that pushed the boundaries of ancient knowledge. Bronze wheels turned steadily, powered by oxen walking endless circles, while leather buckets carried the life-giving water up through carefully constructed shafts to nourish plants that had been transported from the farthest reaches of the known world. Date palms from the southern marshes grew beside cedar trees from distant mountains, their roots drinking from soil that had been carried in countless baskets to create this miracle of cultivation. The fragrance from these elevated gardens perfumed the entire royal quarter, mingling with incense that burned continuously in the nearby temples. Priests in white linen robes moved through ceremonial spaces where the gods of Babylon received their daily offerings of bread, beer, and precious oils. The great temple of Marduk, the city's patron deity, rose like a stepped mountain toward the sky, its summit crowned with a shrine that gleamed with gold leaf and lapis lazuli. Each morning and evening, the faithful gathered in its courtyards to witness rituals that had been performed in the same manner for centuries, uncounted. The palace complex itself sprawled across acres of the city's most sacred ground, its halls decorated with friezes that depicted the king receiving tribute from subject peoples. Audience chambers soared to dizzying heights, their walls lined with glazed brick panels that showed processions of nobles bearing gifts of gold, silver, and exotic animals. Throne rooms echoed with the footsteps of ambassadors from distant kingdoms who came to pay homage to Nebuchadnezzar's power and to negotiate treaties that would preserve peace across the ancient world. In private chambers, scribes worked by oil lamp light, recording the daily business of empire on clay tablets that would preserve their words long after the voices that spoke them had fallen silent. The river Euphrates flowed like a ribbon of silver through the heart of this metropolis, its waters carrying barges laden with grain from the fertile fields upstream. The river's banks were lined with quays where longshoremen unloaded pottery, textiles, and precious stones, while overseers tallied each item on tablets marked with the cuneiform script that had recorded human thought for 3,000 years. Bridges spanned the water on stone piers that had been sunk deep into the riverbed, their arches reflecting in the slow-moving current that had witnessed the rise and fall of kings since the dawn of recorded history. At night, when the desert heat finally released its grip upon the city, oil lamps flickered like earthbound stars throughout Babylon's streets and gardens. The hanging gardens became a constellation of gentle light as flames illuminated the flowering terraces, casting dancing shadows among the leaves, while night-blooming jasmine released its intoxicating perfume into the cooling air. Guards walked their circuits along the great walls, their bronze spear points glinting in the moonlight, while they gazed out across the darkened plains, where jackals called to one another under the vast, star-filled sky. In the palace, Nebuchadnezzar stood upon his balcony, master of all he surveyed, believing in the eternal nature of his dominion, while the same stars that had watched over his ancestors continued their silent vigil overhead. The city slept peacefully within its mighty walls, secure in the knowledge that no force on earth could breach its defenses or challenge the divine authority of its king. Trade routes converged here like the spokes of a great wheel, bringing wealth and wonder from every corner of the known world, while the hanging gardens caught the morning dew and transformed it into the sustenance that nourished paradise itself. Babylon stood complete, a testament to human ambition realized. Unaware that far to the east, in the mountainous realm of Persia, another king was beginning to dream dreams of his own. The grandeur that rose from stone and mortar found its truest expression not merely in defensive walls or terraced gardens, but in the sacred architecture that reached toward the heavens themselves. At the spiritual heart of Babylon stood structures that dwarfed even the most ambitious earthly palaces, their brick surfaces gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun like beacons calling to gods and mortals alike. The ziggurats of Babylon were more than monuments. They were cosmic mountains built by human hands, each one a deliberate attempt to bridge the gap between the terrestrial realm and the dwelling places of the divine. The greatest of these sacred towers, the Etemenanki, rose from the center of the city like a stepped pyramid of unimaginable proportions. Its name, meaning House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, spoke to its purpose as the axis around which the entire universe was believed to turn. 7 terraces climbed skyward, each one smaller than the last, creating a magnificent ascent that seemed to dissolve into the blue expanse above. The lowest level stretched across an area so vast that entire neighborhoods could have fit within its boundaries, its walls constructed from millions of baked bricks, each one stamped with royal inscriptions proclaiming the glory of the gods and the devotion of their earthly servants. As dawn broke over the city each morning, the ziggurat's surfaces would catch the first light and hold it, transforming the entire structure into a golden beacon visible from the farthest reaches of the surrounding plains. The bricks themselves told stories, some glazed in brilliant blues and yellows that created intricate patterns across the facade, others left in their natural terracotta state to provide texture and depth. Between the levels, broad staircases and ramps wound their way upward, allowing the priests to make their daily ascent to the temple that crowned the structure's peak, where Marduk himself was believed to descend from the heavens to commune with his chosen servants. The journey to the summit required not just physical endurance, but spiritual preparation, for each level represented a different sphere of existence, a gradual transition from the mundane world below to the realm of pure divinity above. Pilgrims and priests alike would pause at designated intervals, offering prayers and incense at smaller shrines built into the structure's walls, their voices joining with the constant murmur of worship that seemed to emanate from the ziggurat itself. The air grew thinner as one climbed, not just from altitude, but from the weight of holiness that seemed to press down from the temple above, where golden statues caught and reflected the light of sacred flames that were never allowed to die. Within the temple complex that surrounded the great ziggurat's base, daily life followed rhythms as ancient and precise as the movement of celestial bodies. The priests of Marduk maintained schedules that had been perfected over centuries, their white linen robes moving through courtyards and chambers in patterns that mirrored the divine order they served. Before dawn, while the city still lay shrouded in darkness, the first rituals would begin with the ceremonial awakening of the god's statue, a magnificent figure crafted from precious metals and adorned with jewels that captured even the faintest light and transformed it into brilliant radiance. The statue itself stood taller than 3 men, its features carved with such skill that visitors often reported feeling watched by eyes that seemed to follow their movement through the sacred chambers. Robes of the finest silk, dyed in royal purple and cloth of gold, were changed according to the seasons and festivals, while precious oils, imported from the far corners of the empire, were used to anoint the divine image in ceremonies that could last for hours. The priests who performed these duties had trained for decades to perfect every gesture, every intonation of the ancient prayers that accompanied each sacred act, their movements becoming a form of worship in themselves. Beyond the central temple, the complex spread outward in all directions, encompassing gardens where sacred trees grew in soil believed to have been blessed by the gods themselves, workshops where craftsmen created ritual objects from gold and silver, and libraries where scribes carefully maintained the ancient texts that contained the wisdom of ages. The sound of chanting drifted constantly through these spaces, sometimes rising to fill entire courtyards with harmonious voices, other times falling to whispers that seemed to merge with the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. Incense burned perpetually in bronze braziers placed throughout the complex, its smoke carrying prayers upward, while filling the air with fragrances of myrrh, frankincense, and rare spices that spoke of distant lands and exotic trade routes. The sacred calendar that governed these activities followed the movements of stars and planets with astronomical precision, marking festivals that could last for days and draw hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across the empire. During the great New Year celebration of Akitu, the entire city would transform into a stage for religious pageantry of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Processions would wind through the streets for hours, carrying sacred objects that were revealed to the public only during these most holy occasions, while actors portraying gods and mythical beings would reenact the cosmic battles that had shaped the world's creation. The processional way itself became a river of humanity during these festivals, its glazed brick walls depicting dragons and bulls, seeming to come alive under the movement of torchlight and the press of celebrating crowds. Musicians with instruments crafted specifically for religious ceremonies would play melodies passed down through generations of temple service. their harps and lyres creating soundscapes that seemed to lift the very air and transport listeners beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. The scent of roasted offerings, mixed with burning incense and the perfumes worn by wealthy participants, creating an atmosphere so rich and intoxicating that many described feeling as though they had entered another realm entirely. Even in quieter moments, the spiritual life of Babylon pulsed with constant activity. Smaller temples dedicated to lesser deities dotted the city like stars, each one maintaining its own traditions and serving its own community of worshippers. The goddess Ishtar commanded particular devotion, her temple renowned for ceremonies that celebrated the sacred feminine and the cycles of fertility that governed both human life and agricultural abundance. Here, priestesses trained in arts that combined physical beauty with spiritual wisdom would perform rituals that visitors described as transformative, their movements and chants weaving together earth and sky in celebrations that lasted from sunset to dawn. Private homes throughout the city contained their own shrines, small but carefully maintained spaces where families would gather each evening to offer prayers and small gifts to their household gods. These intimate ceremonies created a network of devotion that connected every dwelling to the greater spiritual matrix of the city, ensuring that divine presence flowed through Babylon's streets and neighborhoods like an invisible river of blessing. Clay figurines of protective spirits stood guard at doorways and corners, their presence so commonplace that children grew up believing that the boundary between divine and mortal worlds was as permeable as morning mist. The priests themselves represented a hierarchy of spiritual achievement that paralleled the political structure of the empire, with the highest ranks requiring not only religious knowledge but skills in astronomy, mathematics, and statecraft that made them advisors to kings and interpreters of divine will. Their training took decades to complete, involving memorization of thousands of prayers and hymns, mastery of complex ritual procedures, and development of the spiritual sensitivity needed to recognize and interpret omens that might guide imperial policy. These men moved through the temple complexes with an authority that commanded instant respect, their presence alone enough to quiet conversations and inspire spontaneous gestures of reverence from anyone who encountered them. As evening approached each day, the great ziggurat would undergo its own transformation, with torches and braziers being lit in careful sequence until the entire structure glowed against the darkening sky like a man-made constellation. The light would draw the eyes of every person in the city upward, reminding them that above the concerns of daily life, above the politics of empire and the struggles of survival, there existed realms of meaning and purpose that connected their small human stories to the vast cosmic drama that played out among the stars overhead, where gods walked and the fate of nations was written in movements too subtle for mortal eyes to detect, yet profound enough to shape the destiny of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The great festivals and sacred ceremonies that bound Babylon to its gods would continue for generations, yet within the royal palace, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The magnificent halls that had once echoed with the confident commands of Nebuchadnezzar II began to witness something far more troubling: the slow, inexorable decline of the mind that had conceived the Hanging Gardens and rebuilt the city in unprecedented splendor. Like shadows lengthening at the end of day, the symptoms of the king's affliction crept through the corridors of power, transforming the very nature of imperial rule. In the early years of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had been a force of nature, his energy seemingly boundless as he directed armies across vast distances and orchestrated building projects that defied imagination. His voice had carried the weight of absolute authority, and his presence had commanded immediate attention from generals, priests, and foreign ambassadors alike. The scribes who recorded his words described a monarch whose intellect moved with the speed of lightning, grasping complex military strategies and architectural challenges with equal facility. Yet time, that great leveler of kings and commoners alike, began to work its subtle changes upon the greatest ruler Babylon had ever known. The transformation began almost imperceptibly, noticed first by those closest to the throne. Palace servants observed that the king's sleep had grown restless, filled with dreams that left him disturbed and disoriented upon waking. His personal scribes noted how his dictation, once flowing and precise, occasionally faltered, as though his thoughts had suddenly scattered like leaves in an autumn wind. The royal physicians, masters of their ancient craft, examined their sovereign with growing concern, finding his pulse irregular and his humours increasingly unbalanced. They prescribed remedies drawn from the wisdom of centuries, herbs from the palace gardens, incantations whispered by moonlight, and ritual purifications performed at dawn, yet none could stem the tide of change that had begun to wash over the royal mind. As months turned to years, the symptoms became more pronounced and impossible to conceal. The king who had once stood before his armies with unwavering confidence now found himself prey to sudden fits of confusion that could strike without warning. During important state meetings, his voice might trail away mid-sentence, his eyes focusing on something invisible to all others in the room. The courtiers learned to wait in respectful silence during these episodes, their faces carefully composed to hide their growing alarm. When Nebuchadnezzar's awareness returned, he would resume speaking as though nothing had occurred, yet the interruption hung in the air like incense, impossible to ignore despite the collective pretense of normalcy. The royal gardens, once his greatest pride, became a refuge where the troubled monarch spent increasingly long hours. Palace guards watched from a respectful distance as their king walked the same paths again and again, sometimes pausing to speak with voices that existed only in his own perception. The carefully cultivated flowers and exotic plants bore silent witness to these solitary wanderings, their beauty unmarred by the tragedy unfolding in their midst. On some days, servants would find Nebuchadnezzar sitting motionless beside the artificial streams, his gaze fixed upon the flowing water as though seeking answers in its endless movement. The hanging gardens, that wonder of the world created to demonstrate Babylon's power and sophistication, had become a sanctuary for a mind gradually losing its grip on reality. The administrative machinery of the empire, built around the king's direct involvement, began to show signs of strain as his participation became increasingly erratic. Ministers, who had grown accustomed to receiving clear, decisive orders, found themselves interpreting fragmentary commands, or worse, implementing policies based on their best guesses about royal intentions. The Great Seal of Babylon, once applied to documents only after careful royal review, now appeared on scrolls that the king might have approved in moments of clarity or confusion. None could be certain which. Provincial governors, accustomed to regular communication from the capital, found their reports acknowledged with responses that seemed disconnected from the questions they had posed. Religious ceremonies, those elaborate displays of royal piety that reinforced the king's divine mandate, became increasingly challenging to coordinate. The high priests of Marduk found themselves managing a delicate balance, ensuring that the sacred rituals proceeded according to ancient custom, while accommodating a sovereign whose participation had become unpredictable. During the New Year festival, the most important celebration in the Babylonian calendar, courtiers held their breath as Nebuchadnezzar performed his ceremonial role. Sometimes he moved through the ancient rites with his old authority, every gesture precise and meaningful. Other times he would pause mid-ritual, his expression distant and uncertain, requiring gentle guidance from the attending priests to complete the sacred acts. The king's physical appearance began to reflect his mental deterioration. The carefully maintained beard, symbol of royal dignity throughout Mesopotamian history, grew unkempt during his periods of distraction. His royal robes, once worn with meticulous attention to their symbolic significance, sometimes appeared disheveled or stained. Palace barbers and dressers developed subtle strategies to maintain the royal appearance without seeming to notice when their sovereign had neglected his grooming. The great throne room, where Nebuchadnezzar had once received foreign dignitaries with imposing grandeur, witnessed audiences where the king might lose track of conversations or respond to questions that had not been asked. Foreign ambassadors, trained in the art of reading royal moods and intentions, found themselves navigating increasingly treacherous diplomatic waters. Treaties that might have been concluded in a single audience now required multiple visits, as the king's attention wandered or his memory failed to retain the details of previous discussions. Some diplomatic missions were forced to extend their stays in Babylon for months, waiting for moments of royal clarity that might allow important negotiations to proceed. The reputation of Babylonian power, built upon decades of consistent and overwhelming force, began to suffer as word spread through the ancient world of the great king's declining faculties. Within the royal family, the crisis created its own complex dynamics of power and responsibility. Queen mothers and royal wives, traditionally confined to the private quarters of the palace, found themselves wielding increasing influence as court officials sought guidance that the king could no longer reliably provide. The crown prince and other potential heirs watched their father's decline with a mixture of sorrow and calculation, knowing that the succession question would soon demand resolution. Palace intrigue, always present in any royal court, intensified as various factions positioned themselves for the eventual transition of power. The great building projects that had defined Nebuchadnezzar's reign began to suffer from lack of consistent direction. The armies of workers who had labored to fulfill the king's architectural visions found their tasks complicated by contradictory orders or sudden changes in plan that seemed to have no logical basis. Master builders, accustomed to working with a sovereign who understood every technical detail of their craft, struggled to adapt to a patron whose interest might shift unpredictably from moment to moment. Some construction sites fell silent for weeks at a time, waiting for royal decisions that never came or came in forms too confused to implement. The military, backbone of Babylonian power, faced particular challenges as their commander-in-chief's condition deteriorated. Generals who had served under Nebuchadnezzar during his greatest campaigns watched with heavy hearts as the strategic mind that had conquered Jerusalem and humbled Egypt became increasingly unreliable. The king, who had once personally led armies across the desert, now sometimes failed to recognize his most trusted officers. Military decisions that required swift action were delayed or made based on incomplete understanding of the strategic situation. The great war machine that had extended Babylonian influence from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf began to operate with diminishing effectiveness, its coordination hampered by uncertainty at the very top of the chain of command. As the reality of the king's condition became impossible to deny, the very foundations of royal authority began to shift. The divine mandate that had justified absolute rule seemed somehow diminished when exercised by a mind that could no longer grasp the full complexity of governance. Yet the institutional momentum of empire continued, carrying Babylon forward through the sheer weight of established custom and the dedication of countless officials who maintained their posts despite the growing chaos at the center of power. The great city continued to function, its markets bustling with trade, its temples maintaining their ancient rhythms, even as the royal palace became the stage for a slow-motion tragedy that would reshape the future of the ancient world. As the great king's mind wandered through realms of divine madness, the bustling streets of Babylon continued their eternal dance of commerce and learning, largely untouched by the palace's growing shadows. The merchants who had once looked to Nebuchadnezzar's conquests for their prosperity now turned their attention to more reliable sources of wealth, the intricate networks of trade that stretched like golden threads across the known world. In the markets that sprawled beneath the hanging gardens, the air thrummed with languages from a dozen lands, creating a symphony of human enterprise that had endured through dynasties and would outlast kings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as caravans arrived from the eastern mountains, their camels heavy with precious stones and aromatic spices that had traveled months through desert winds. These hardy traders, their faces weathered by countless journeys, possessed an understanding of distance and time that transcended the concerns of royal courts. Their ledgers, written in cuneiform on clay tablets that would survive millennia, recorded not just transactions, but the pulse of an interconnected world. Silver changed hands with the fluid grace of ritual, weighed on bronze scales that had been perfected over generations, their accuracy ensuring that trust could flourish between strangers separated by vast cultural chasms. Within the workshops that lined Babylon's great thoroughfares, artisans practiced trades that had been refined through centuries of accumulated wisdom. The metalworkers who shaped bronze into tools and weapons understood the secret temperatures at which copper and tin would merge into something stronger than either element alone. Their furnaces glowed like earthbound stars in the pre-dawn darkness, tended by apprentices who learned through observation and repetition the ancient mysteries of transformation. Gold flowed like liquid sunlight under their hammers, taking the shapes of jewelry that would adorn the wealthy wives of distant merchants, each piece carrying within its gleaming surface the skill of hands guided by inherited knowledge. The textile quarters buzzed with the gentle rhythm of looms, where weavers created fabrics of such complexity that their patterns seemed to capture the very mathematics of creation itself. Purple-dyed wool from the coastal cities commanded prices that could purchase small farms, while silk that had travelled the length of Asia whispered through their fingers like captured wind. These master weavers possessed an intuitive understanding of colour and pattern that bordered on the mystical, their creations becoming currency in their own right, traded in markets from the Black Sea to the shores of the Indian Ocean. Mathematics flourished in Babylon with a precision that would influence human thought for millennia to come. In the scribal schools attached to the great temples, young minds grappled with concepts that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. The base 60 system that governed their calculations allowed for computations of breathtaking complexity, enabling astronomers to predict eclipses decades in advance, and architects to construct buildings that seemed to defy the laws of physics. These mathematical principles flowed naturally into the merchant quarters, where traders calculated interest rates and compound returns with a sophistication that would not be matched in many parts of the world for centuries. The banks of Babylon operated with a level of financial sophistication that rivaled institutions of far later eras. The House of Murashu maintained records that spanned generations, tracking loans and investments across the empire with meticulous care. Their archives, stored in specially constructed chambers designed to protect clay tablets from moisture and time, contained the financial history of thousands of families, creating a web of economic relationships that bound the empire together more securely than any military force. Interest rates fluctuated with the seasons and the political climate, but the fundamental principles of credit and debt provided a stability that transcended the rise and fall of individual rulers. Astronomers working in the ziggurats above the city mapped the movements of celestial bodies with an accuracy that seems almost supernatural by the standards of their time. Their observations, recorded night after night on tablets that accumulated into libraries of cosmic knowledge, revealed patterns in the heavens that suggested an underlying order to the universe itself. These scholar priests understood that the wandering stars followed predictable paths, and their calculations enabled them to create calendars of unprecedented precision. The practical applications of their work extended far beyond religious ceremony. Farmers planned their planting by astronomical calculations, and merchants timed their voyages to coincide with favorable celestial alignments. The medical practitioners of Babylon combined empirical observation with mystical understanding in ways that produced genuine healing. Their diagnostic methods, refined through generations of careful study, recognized symptoms and patterns that modern medicine would later validate through different means. Herbs gathered from distant lands were prepared according to formulas that balanced not just their chemical properties, but their presumed spiritual essences. Surgery was performed with bronze instruments of remarkable sophistication, and the survival rates for certain procedures suggest levels of skill that would not be surpassed for many centuries. In the great library attached to the Temple of Marduk, scribes continued the monumental task of preserving human knowledge against the erosion of time. Their copying work required not just literacy, but deep understanding, as they translated between languages and writing systems while maintaining the essential meaning of ancient texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh existed in dozens of versions, each slightly different, as scribes added their own cultural perspectives to the eternal story. Legal codes, religious texts, mathematical treatises, and astronomical observations accumulated in systematic collections that represented humanity's first great attempt at organizing all knowledge under a single roof. The diplomatic correspondence that flowed through Babylon revealed a world far more interconnected than later ages would imagine possible. Letters written in Akkadian served as the lingua franca for communications between Egypt and Persia, between the Greek city-states and the kingdoms of Anatolia. These diplomatic pouches carried not just political intelligence, but cultural exchange, as ideas about art, religion, and philosophy spread across continents with each messenger's journey. The scribes who composed these letters possessed linguistic skills that encompassed multiple writing systems and cultural frameworks, making them the invisible architects of international relations. Water management in Babylon represented perhaps the greatest achievement of practical engineering in the ancient world. The canal systems that brought life to the desert required constant maintenance and sophisticated understanding of hydraulics. Teams of engineers, working with mathematical precision, calculated flow rates and gradients that would keep the waters moving at optimal speed. The great pumps that lifted water to the hanging gardens operated through ingenious systems of gears and counterweights, their bronze mechanisms polished to perfection by craftsmen who understood both the theoretical principles and practical demands of their task. As the sun reached its zenith over the great city, casting the shortest shadows of the day, the accumulated wisdom of centuries continued to flow through Babylon's streets and workshops like an invisible river. The merchants counted their profits in silver that bore the images of kings both living and dead, while mathematicians in quiet chambers worked equations that would influence human thought long after the walls of Babylon had crumbled into dust. This was a civilization at its intellectual peak, even as the foundations of political power began their slow subsidence beneath the weight of time and the inexorable approach of change from the eastern mountains. While the scribes of Babylon bent over their tablets, calculating the movements of celestial bodies and recording the transactions that flowed like rivers through their magnificent city, far to the east across the Zagros Mountains, another destiny was being written in the dust and stone of the Persian highlands. The same sun that illuminated the glazed brick walls of Nebuchadnezzar's palace cast its light across a landscape both harsher and more enduring, where the rhythms of life followed patterns older than the ziggurat temples, where the blood of ancient nomadic peoples still pulsed through the veins of scattered tribes who had learned to find strength in the marriage of movement and stillness. Among the Pasargadae tribe, in the shadow of peaks that scraped the belly of heaven itself, a child was born into circumstances that would have seemed unremarkable to any observer blessed with the gift of foresight. The infant drew his first breath in air thin with altitude and sharp with the scent of wild thyme and mountain sage, his cries echoing across valleys where eagles circled and streams ran cold with snowmelt even in the heat of summer. His father Cambyses ruled a domain measured not in the grand avenues and soaring towers beloved by Mesopotamian kings, but in the loyalty of horsemen and the seasonal migrations that had sustained their people since time immemorial. The boy who would one day be called Cyrus grew tall and strong in this land, where survival demanded both cunning and courage, where the harsh beauty of the mountains taught lessons that no royal tutor could impart. His early years unfolded against a backdrop of endless sky and wind-carved stone, seasons marked not by the flooding of rivers or the harvest of barley fields, but by the movement of flocks between summer and winter pastures. The rhythm of hoofbeats on ancient paths, the crackle of fires around which elders shared stories that stretched back through generations, like unbroken threads connecting the present to a past both heroic and terrible. The Persians, among whom Cyrus learned the arts of leadership, were a people caught between worlds, inheritors of the great nomadic traditions that had once swept across the steppes, yet increasingly drawn to the settled ways of their more sophisticated neighbours. They had absorbed much from the civilizations that surrounded them. The administrative techniques of the Medes to their north, the commercial practices of the trading cities that dotted the routes between East and West, the military innovations that filtered through the mountain passes, along with merchants and craftsmen seeking new markets for their skills. Yet for all this borrowed wisdom, the core of Persian identity remained rooted in older values, in concepts of honor and loyalty that had sustained tribal confederations through countless wars and migrations. Cyrus absorbed these teachings as naturally as he learned to sit a horse or draw a bow, understanding instinctively that true power lay not in the accumulation of wealth or the construction of monuments, but in the ability to inspire others to follow where he might choose to lead. The young prince observed how his father balanced the competing claims of different clan leaders, how disputes were settled around council fires, where words carried as much weight as swords, how alliances were forged through marriage and mutual oath-swearing that bound families and tribes together in networks of obligation that could span vast distances. As Cyrus matured from boy to youth to young man, the political landscape around him shifted like sand dunes before prevailing winds. The great powers of the age, Babylon with its merchant princes and scholarly priests, Egypt with its ancient pharaonic traditions, Lydia with its golden coins and Western connections, seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. Yet perceptive observers could detect signs of weakness in even the mightiest empires. The very wealth and sophistication that made these civilizations great also made them vulnerable, their populations grown soft with luxury, their armies dependent on mercenaries whose loyalty extended only as far as their next payment, their rulers isolated behind palace walls from the harsh realities that shaped the lives of common people. The Median kingdom that sprawled across the Iranian plateau represented a different model, one that combined the military prowess of the nomadic tradition with the organizational structures necessary to govern settled populations. Under kings like Astyages, the Medes had created a confederation that extended their influence from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the borders of Mesopotamia itself, demanding tribute from lesser rulers while allowing them to maintain their traditional customs and local autonomy. This system appealed to the young Cyrus, who could see how it preserved the essential spirit of tribal independence while channeling collective energy toward larger purposes. Yet even as he learned from Median example, Cyrus began to envision possibilities that extended far beyond mere imitation of existing models. The scattered Persian tribes possessed advantages that their more urbanized neighbors had forgotten: the mobility that came from lives spent in the saddle, the hardiness forged by harsh climates and challenging terrain, the cohesion that emerged from shared hardship and mutual dependence. These qualities, properly harnessed and directed, could become the foundation for something unprecedented in the long history of the region, a power that combined the best elements of nomadic and sedentary traditions while transcending the limitations of both. The transformation of Cyrus from tribal prince to unifying leader did not happen suddenly, like lightning splitting the night sky, but rather like the slow accumulation of snow on high peaks that eventually becomes an avalanche reshaping entire valleys. His reputation spread first among his own people, as tales circulated of his wisdom in council and his courage in the small conflicts that periodically erupted between neighboring tribes. Stories began to attach themselves to his name: how he had mediated a dispute over grazing rights that had threatened to divide the Pasargadae, how he had led a raid against bandits who had been preying on merchant caravans, how he had shown mercy to enemies while never compromising the essential interests of his followers. These early successes attracted the attention of other Persian leaders, men who ruled their own clans and commanded their own warriors, but who recognized in the young prince qualities that transcended ordinary ambition. They saw in him someone who could articulate a vision large enough to encompass all the scattered Persian tribes, someone who possessed both the practical skills necessary to forge alliances and the more intangible gift of inspiring others to believe in possibilities they had never dared to imagine. One by one, through a complex process of negotiation, demonstration, and mutual commitment, these leaders began to acknowledge Cyrus as more than merely first among equals. The unification of the Persian tribes under Cyrus's leadership represented more than a simple political realignment. It marked the emergence of a new force in the ancient world, one that would soon challenge assumptions that had governed international relations for centuries. The young king, who had learned his earliest lessons in the shadow of mountain peaks, who had absorbed the wisdom of nomadic traditions while recognizing the potential of settled civilization, who had demonstrated his ability to inspire loyalty while never losing sight of practical necessities, now stood poised to test his vision against the established powers that divided the known world among themselves, like players sharing pieces on an enormous game board. From the terraces of Babylon, where astronomers tracked the movements of planets and mathematicians calculated the flow of commerce through distant markets, the rise of this Persian shepherd's son might have seemed as remote and insignificant as the mountains from which he emerged. Yet the same forces that had shaped Cyrus in the highlands, the harsh beauty that demanded strength, the ancient wisdom that prized honor above comfort, the tribal bonds that could transform individual warriors into an irresistible collective force, were about to collide with the sophisticated but increasingly fragile world of Mesopotamian civilization, setting in motion changes that would echo across continents and down through centuries, reshaping the map of the ancient world in ways that none could foresee. From the highlands, where tribal bonds had forged him into a leader, Cyrus gazed westward across the vast expanse of Anatolia, where the kingdom of Lydia glittered like a jewel set between two worlds. The morning mist clung to the valleys below his camp, and through that ethereal veil, the Persian king could envision the ancient trade routes that carried silk from distant China and spices from India, all flowing through the prosperous cities that acknowledged Lydian rule. The shepherd, who had once watched over flocks in the mountain pastures, had transformed into something far more formidable, a conqueror whose ambitions stretched beyond the borders of any single realm. Lydia represented more than territorial expansion. It embodied the crossroads of civilization itself, where European merchants haggled with Asian traders in marketplaces that had witnessed the ebb and flow of empires for centuries beyond counting. King Croesus ruled this kingdom with the confidence that came from possessing wealth so legendary that his very name had become synonymous with riches throughout the known world. The Lydian treasury overflowed with gold drawn from the Pactolus River, where legends whispered that King Midas had once bathed to rid himself of his golden curse. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi before considering any military action, and the cryptic prophecies had seemed to promise victory to whoever struck first in the coming conflict. The Persian army that assembled in the foothills resembled a living tapestry woven from the diverse peoples who had already bent their knees to Cyrus. Median cavalry rode alongside Persian infantry, their bronze-scaled armor gleaming in the autumn sunlight, while auxiliaries from conquered territories brought their own fighting traditions to this growing force. The sound of 10,000 horses created a thunder that rolled across the landscape like an approaching storm, and the dust raised by their passage formed clouds that could be seen from great distances. Cyrus moved among his troops with the easy confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His presence transforming nervous conscripts into devoted followers, willing to march across continents at his command. The season favored movement, with the brutal heat of summer giving way to the crisp clarity of early autumn. Supply trains stretched behind the advancing army like the segmented body of some enormous creature, carrying not just weapons and provisions, but the tools of siege warfare that would prove essential in reducing fortified cities. Persian engineers had studied the arts of war from every conquered people, adapting Babylonian techniques for undermining walls and incorporating Assyrian methods for constructing massive siege engines. The knowledge accumulated from fallen empires now served the expansion of a new one, each campaign building upon lessons learned in previous conquests. Sardis, the capital of Lydia, rose from the fertile plains like a crown of white stone, its acropolis perched upon an almost impregnable crag that had defied attackers for generations. The city's lower districts sprawled outward in concentric rings, each protected by walls that represented different eras of construction and improvement. Markets bustled with activity, even as scouts brought word of the approaching Persian host, for the merchants of Sardis had grown wealthy by adapting to changing political circumstances rather than fleeing from them. The smell of exotic spices mingled with the acrid smoke from metalworking shops, where craftsmen hammered gold into intricate jewelry that would soon adorn Persian nobles rather than Lydian aristocrats. Croesus assembled his own forces with the methodical precision of a commander who had never faced a truly existential threat to his kingdom. Lydian heavy cavalry formed the backbone of his army, their horses bred for strength, and their riders trained from childhood in the arts of mounted combat. Greek mercenaries provided disciplined infantry formations, their bronze shields and long spears creating hedgehogs of gleaming metal that had proven effective against less organized opponents. The Lydian king had also secured alliances with neighboring powers, promises of mutual support that existed more on parchment than in the hearts of rulers who watched the Persian advance with growing unease about their own futures. The initial encounters between the two forces resembled a deadly dance performed across the rolling hills west of Sardis. Persian-like cavalry swept forward in clouds, their arrows darkening the sky before melting away like morning mist when the Lydians advanced to meet them. These skirmishes served multiple purposes beyond inflicting casualties. They allowed Cyrus to study his enemy's tactics while demonstrating to potential allies the futility of opposing Persian arms. Each engagement ended with Lydian forces retreating toward their capital, leaving behind wounded pride and growing doubts about their king's assurances of divine favor. The decisive confrontation came when autumn rains had turned the roads to mud and the campaigning season seemed nearly over. Croesus, perhaps influenced by oracular advice or simply eager to end the uncertainty that was disrupting trade throughout his kingdom, chose to offer battle on a broad plain where his cavalry could operate to maximum advantage. The morning fog hung heavy over both armies as they deployed in the pre-dawn darkness, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where the clash of metal and the neighing of horses seemed muffled and distant. Persian war drums beat a rhythm that seemed to echo from the earth itself, while Lydian trumpets answered with their own martial songs. The battle unfolded with a ferocity that surprised both sides, as months of skirmishing erupted into a full-scale melee that stretched across miles of contested ground. Lydian cavalry charged with devastating effect, their heavy horses smashing through Persian infantry formations and creating gaps that threatened to fragment Cyrus's entire battle line. The Persian king himself rode to the most threatened sectors, his presence rallying troops who had begun to waver under the relentless pressure of mounted attacks. The conflict raged throughout the morning, with neither side able to claim decisive advantage, though the field grew littered with the debris of war, and the cries of wounded men created a chorus of agony that rose above the clash of weapons. The turning point came when Persian reserves, held back throughout the morning's fighting, struck the Lydian flank at the moment when Croesus's cavalry had committed itself to what appeared to be a final, decisive charge. These fresh troops, many of them Median horsemen whose mobility matched that of their opponents, transformed the orderly Lydian advance into confused retreat. The psychological impact of this reversal rippled through the ranks faster than any messenger could ride, and within hours, the organized resistance of Lydian forces had dissolved into scattered groups, seeking only to reach the safety of Sardis's walls. Croesus himself barely escaped the carnage, his royal standard abandoned on a field now controlled by Persian scavengers who moved among the fallen like carrion birds. The retreat to Sardis became a route that left the roads clogged with abandoned equipment and demoralized soldiers who had witnessed their king's invincibility shattered in a single afternoon. The gates of the capital city closed behind the remnants of the Lydian army, but those massive portals no longer represented security. They had become the bars of a prison that would soon be tested by the most sophisticated siege techniques the ancient world had yet devised. The siege of Sardis began immediately, with Persian engineers surveying the city's defenses, while construction crews prepared the massive earthworks that would support their assault. The Acropolis that had seemed impregnable from a distance revealed weaknesses that trained eyes could exploit, particularly where winter rains had eroded the foundations of ancient walls. Cyrus established his headquarters on a hill that commanded views of both the city and the surrounding countryside, ensuring that no relief force could approach without his knowledge, while also positioning himself to observe every aspect of the siege operations. Winter deepened around the besieged city, bringing hardships that affected both attackers and defenders, but gradually tilting the balance toward those who controlled the surrounding territory. Persian supply lines stretched back to the heartland of the empire, carrying not just provisions, but reinforcements and siege equipment that arrived in steady streams despite the deteriorating weather. Within Sardis, however, the stores accumulated during years of prosperity began to dwindle, and the confidence that had sustained the defenders through the early weeks of siege gave way to a grim awareness that their situation grew more desperate with each passing day. As the Persian armies consolidated their dominance over the ancient world, securing victory after victory across the vast expanse of the known lands, the great city of Babylon seemed to exist in a realm apart from the gathering storm clouds of change. Within its towering walls, adorned with glazed bricks that caught the Mesopotamian sunlight and threw it back in brilliant blues and golds, life continued with the measured rhythm that had sustained the empire for generations. The hanging gardens cascaded in their terraced splendor, their exotic blooms perfuming the air with fragrances from distant lands, while the Euphrates flowed serenely past the city's foundations, carrying with it the silent whispers of history in the making. In the royal palace, where corridors stretched like rivers of polished stone beneath ceilings painted with stars and mythological beasts, King Belshazzar ruled as regent in his father's absence. Nabonidus, the actual king, had withdrawn to the desert oasis of Tama, pursuing his obsession with lunar worship and archaeological excavations, leaving his son to manage the day-to-day governance of an empire that had grown complacent in its own magnificence. The prince regent moved through halls where the footsteps of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar had once echoed, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of centuries, perhaps unaware that each passing day brought Cyrus and his disciplined Persian forces closer to the very gates of his ancient capital. The palace scribes continued their meticulous work in chambers lined with thousands of cuneiform tablets, recording grain distributions and tax collections with the same careful precision their predecessors had employed for over a millennium. Clay remained damp under their skilled styluses as they pressed wedge-shaped marks into surfaces that would outlast the empire itself, creating records that future archaeologists would uncover in wonder. The royal workshops hummed with activity as craftsmen shaped gold into intricate jewelry and carved ivory into delicate figurines, their artistry representing the pinnacle of Babylonian culture, even as the political foundations of their world began to shift beneath them, like sand dunes reshaped by desert winds. Throughout the sprawling metropolis, merchants from across the known world continued to gather in the great bazaars, their voices creating a polyglot symphony as they negotiated deals in Aramaic, Akkadian, and a dozen other tongues. Caravans arrived dusty from journeys across Syrian deserts and Anatolian plateaus, their camels loaded with precious stones, rare spices, and bolts of silk that shimmered like captured moonlight. The aroma of cinnamon and frankincense mingled with the earthier scents of leather and livestock, while the sound of hammer on anvil rang out from the metalworkers' quarter, where bronze and iron took shape under skilled hands that had learned their craft through generations of inherited knowledge. As the seasons turned, and Persian influence expanded like ripples across the surface of an ancient pond, subtle changes began to manifest within Babylon's seemingly impregnable walls. Foreign emissaries arrived with increasing frequency, their diplomatic pouches sealed with unfamiliar insignias, while whispered conversations in palace corridors carried undertones of uncertainty that had not been heard for decades. The great ziggurat of Marduk, that towering monument to Babylonian religious supremacy, continued to dominate the skyline like a man-made mountain, its stepped sides catching the changing light of dawn and dusk. Yet the priests who climbed its sacred stairs seemed increasingly preoccupied with omens and portents that spoke of transformation on the horizon. In this atmosphere of growing tension, masked by surface tranquility, Belshazzar chose to assert the grandeur and continuity of Babylonian power through a display of unprecedented magnificence. The decision to hold a great feast came as the harvest season reached its peak, when the granaries overflowed with barley and wheat, and the date palms hung heavy with their golden fruit. Palace servants scurried through the endless corridors like industrious ants, preparing chambers that had witnessed the celebrations of kings whose names were already becoming legend, polishing bronze mirrors until they gleamed like captured sunlight, and arranging furniture that had been crafted by master artisans in ages past. The great banquet hall, a vast space capable of accommodating 1,000 guests beneath a ceiling supported by columns carved with the intertwined forms of dragons and bulls, became the stage for what would prove to be one of history's most fateful gatherings. Tapestries, woven with threads of gold and silver, hung from the walls, depicting scenes of royal hunts and divine conquests, while the floor consisted of polished stones, arranged in intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the flickering light of hundreds of oil lamps. The air grew thick with the mingled aromas of roasted meats, exotic spices, and the sweet smoke of incense that burned in elaborate bronze braziers, shaped like mythical beasts. As evening deepened over the ancient city, the sound of celebration began to echo through the palace halls. Musicians struck their harps and lyres with practiced fingers, creating melodies that had entertained royalty for generations, while singers raised their voices in hymns of praise that spoke of eternal dominion and divine favor. The assembled nobles, dressed in robes of finest linen and silk, adorned themselves with jewelry that caught and reflected the lamplight in countless tiny stars, their conversations flowing as freely as the wine that filled golden goblets crafted by master smiths, whose techniques had been perfected over centuries of royal patronage. The feast itself became a monument to Babylonian abundance and sophistication, with tables groaning under the weight of delicacies gathered from across the empire's vast territories. Peacocks roasted with aromatic herbs shared space with honeyed fruits from distant orchards, while exotic fish from the Persian Gulf lay arranged on platters of precious metals, alongside breads shaped into the forms of sacred animals. Wine flowed from amphorae that bore the seals of vineyards established in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, its deep red color seeming to glow with inner fire, as it filled cups that had been passed down through royal generations like liquid rubies touched with ancient magic. In this atmosphere of celebration and excess, Belshazzar made a decision that would echo through history with the resonance of a temple bell. Perhaps emboldened by wine, or motivated by a desire to demonstrate the supremacy of Babylonian gods over foreign deities, he commanded that the sacred vessels looted from the Temple of Solomon be brought forth from the royal treasury. These golden cups and bowls, which had once held the most sacred offerings in Jerusalem, emerged from their storage places like ghosts from another age, their surfaces reflecting the lamplight with a brilliance that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. The moment these holy vessels touched the lips of the Babylonian nobles, filled with wine in honor of gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone, the very atmosphere of the great hall seemed to shift and change. The shadows cast by the flickering oil lamps appeared to deepen and take on shapes that had not been there moments before, while a subtle chill entered the air despite the warmth generated by hundreds of human bodies and dozens of burning braziers. Conversations grew quieter, as if some invisible presence had entered the chamber, and even the music seemed to take on a more subdued and somber tone. The writing appeared without warning, as if drawn by an invisible hand across the smooth plaster of the wall directly facing the royal table. The letters blazed with their own inner light, forming words in ancient Aramaic that seemed to burn themselves into the consciousness of every person present. The celebration ceased as abruptly as if a great wind had extinguished every lamp simultaneously, leaving only the supernatural glow of the mysterious inscription to illuminate faces frozen in expressions of terror and bewilderment. Even the servants froze in their positions, wine jugs suspended in mid-pour, as the weight of divine judgment settled over the assembly like a suffocating blanket woven from the threads of destiny itself. The great bronze gates of Babylon stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness of October 539 BCE, their massive forms casting long shadows across the sacred processional way that had witnessed centuries of triumph and ceremony. Within the palace walls, the echoes of Belshazzar's feast had faded to whispers, and the mysterious writing that had appeared on the wall seemed to hang in the air like morning mist, its prophetic words having already begun their inexorable journey toward fulfillment. The city that had dominated the ancient world for generations now waited in an uneasy stillness, its fate suspended between the dying breath of one era and the first stirrings of another. Cyrus the Great had positioned his forces with the patience of a master chess player contemplating the final moves of a complex game. His army stretched across the Mesopotamian landscape like a great crescent moon, encompassing the mighty city not with the brutal encirclement of a typical siege, but with the measured precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The Persian king had long understood that Babylon's strength lay not merely in its towering walls and defended gates, but in the hearts and minds of its diverse population, a tapestry of peoples who had been woven together under Babylonian rule for decades. To conquer such a city through force alone would risk destroying the very prize he sought to claim, and Cyrus was far too wise a ruler to mistake destruction for victory. The strategy that unfolded in those crucial hours before dawn represented the culmination of months of careful diplomatic preparation and psychological warfare. Persian envoys had moved through the city like shadows in the weeks leading up to this moment, carrying messages not of conquest, but of liberation, speaking in hushed tones to merchants in the marketplace, to priests in the temples, and to administrators in the government quarters. These were not the harsh pronouncements of a would-be conqueror, but the gentle promises of a king who presented himself as chosen by the gods themselves to restore proper order to a realm grown corrupt under its current rulers. Word spread through Babylon's winding streets and towering ziggurats that Cyrus came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, ordained by divine will to free the people from the perceived excesses and religious innovations of their Chaldean overlords. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern walls of the great city, a remarkable transformation began to unfold along the banks of the Euphrates River. The massive gates that had protected Babylon for centuries, those bronze monuments to the city's power and defiance, began to swing open with a sound like distant thunder rolling across the plains. The guards who had manned these positions through the long night stepped aside, their weapons lowered, their faces bearing expressions not of defeat, but of something approaching relief. This was not the desperate last stand that had marked the fall of so many other ancient cities, but rather something unprecedented in the annals of military history, a surrender born not of fear, but of welcome. Cyrus himself rode through the Ishtar Gate as the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, his horse's hooves echoing against the glazed bricks that depicted the sacred dragons and bulls of Babylonian mythology. The Persian king had chosen his entry carefully, eschewing the typical pageantry of conquest for something far more subtle and profound. He came not in the gleaming armor of a victorious general, but in the simple robes of a humble servant of the gods, his bearing dignified but not arrogant, his manner suggesting reverence for the ancient city he was now claiming rather than contempt for its fallen state. Behind him rode a carefully selected retinue, men chosen not for their ferocity in battle, but for their wisdom in administration and their understanding of the delicate art of governing diverse peoples. The streets of Babylon that morning presented a scene unlike any witnessed in the long history of ancient warfare. Citizens emerged from their homes not to flee or hide, but to observe this peaceful transition with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Children peered from behind their parents' robes, while merchants stood in the doorways of their shops, watching as Persian soldiers marched past with discipline and restraint that spoke volumes about the character of their commander. There was no looting, no burning, no screaming of the conquered, only the measured tread of an army that had been taught to see itself not as conquerors, but as liberators, bringing order to a realm that had grown weary of chaos. In the great temple of Marduk, the city's patron deity, priests who had expected to face persecution or death, instead found themselves approached by Persian officials bearing messages of respect and continuity. Cyrus had made it clear, through his representatives, that the religious traditions of Babylon would not only be preserved, but actively supported under his rule. This was revolutionary thinking, in an age when conquest typically meant the imposition of the victor's gods upon the defeated, when temples were routinely destroyed and priests scattered to the winds. The Persian approach represented a fundamental shift in the philosophy of empire, one that recognized the strength that could be found in diversity rather than uniformity. The palace complex itself yielded with the same strange absence of violence that had characterized the entire operation. Belshazzar, the crown prince who had so recently hosted his fateful feast, was nowhere to be found. Some accounts suggest he had fled in the night, others that he had been quietly removed by his own courtiers who sought to curry favor with the new regime. The halls that had echoed with revelry just days before now witnessed a different kind of gathering, as Persian administrators met with Babylonian officials to discuss the peaceful transition of power. Maps were spread across tables where golden vessels had so recently held wine, and the sound of quiet conversation replaced the music and laughter of the feast that had marked the empire's end. Cyrus established himself in the royal quarters with characteristic restraint, making few changes to the existing arrangements beyond what was necessary to establish clear lines of authority. The great king understood that true conquest came not from the destruction of existing systems, but from their careful integration into a larger framework of governance. Babylonian administrators, who showed competence and loyalty, found themselves retained in their positions, while the complex machinery of taxation and trade that had made the city wealthy continued to function under new management. This was conquest as art form, the subjugation of a great power achieved not through devastation, but through transformation. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, that ancient document that would later be hailed as one of history's first charters of human rights, had its origins in these peaceful hours following Babylon's surrender. Even as his forces secured the city, Cyrus was already composing the proclamations that would define his rule. Documents that spoke of restoration rather than conquest, of the return of displaced peoples to their homelands, and the rebuilding of temples that had fallen into disrepair. The cylinder's cuneiform inscription would declare that Marduk himself had chosen Cyrus to rule, that the gods had grown weary of Babylonian misrule and had called upon the Persian king to restore justice and proper worship to the land. News of Babylon's peaceful surrender spread across the ancient world with the speed of wildfire, carried by traders and diplomats who could scarcely believe what they had witnessed. Here was proof that even the mightiest of cities, even the most seemingly impregnable of fortresses, could fall without a single siege engine, without rivers of blood flowing through the streets, without the smoke of burning buildings darkening the sky. The implications were staggering for rulers throughout the known world, for if Babylon could yield so completely to the promise of better governance, what city could consider itself truly secure against the combination of military might and diplomatic wisdom that Cyrus had demonstrated? The bloodless victory at Babylon represented far more than a single military triumph. It marked the emergence of a new model of empire building that would influence rulers and conquerors for centuries to come. In demonstrating that cities could be won through wisdom as readily as through warfare, that peoples could be governed through respect as effectively as through fear, Cyrus had authored a new chapter in the story of human civilization. The great ziggurats of Babylon still rose toward the heavens, the Euphrates still flowed past the city's walls, and life continued much as it had before. Yet everything had changed, for the world had witnessed the birth of an empire built not on the ashes of its predecessors, but on their transformation into something greater than they had ever been alone. The morning light filtered through the palace corridors of Babylon, casting long shadows across marble floors that had witnessed the footsteps of kings for over 1,000 years. In these hushed chambers, where the scent of cedar and frankincense still lingered from the previous evening's ceremonies, Cyrus the Great began to craft something unprecedented in the annals of human history. The Persian conqueror, having entered the city without spilling a single drop of blood, now faced the delicate task of binding together an empire that stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the foothills of the Hindu Kush, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and sacred traditions. The scribes gathered in the royal chancellery, their reed styluses poised above fresh clay tablets, waiting to record the words that would echo across centuries. Outside the palace windows, the great ziggurat of Marduk rose against the azure sky, its stepped terraces a testament to Babylonian devotion to their patron deity. The city's inhabitants moved cautiously through the streets, uncertain what this change of rulership might bring to their ancient customs and cherished beliefs. Previous conquerors had swept through Mesopotamia like desert storms, leaving broken temples and scattered populations in their wake, forcing subjugated peoples to abandon their gods and adopt the victor's ways. Yet, Cyrus possessed a vision that transcended the conventional wisdom of imperial dominion. As he stood in the throne room where Nabonidus had once held court, surrounded by advisors who spoke in hushed Persian and Median tongues, the king contemplated the revolutionary path that lay before him. The massive walls of Babylon enclosed not merely another conquered city, but the beating heart of ancient civilization itself, a repository of knowledge, tradition, and spiritual practice that had flourished when his own Persian ancestors were still nomadic herders on the Iranian plateau. Rather than viewing this diversity as a threat to be eliminated, Cyrus recognized it as a source of strength to be cultivated and preserved. The concept began to take shape in the king's mind, like a potter shaping clay on the wheel, each turn revealing new dimensions of possibility. Traditional imperial policy demanded the systematic destruction of local customs, the deportation of influential citizens, and the installation of Persian governors who would rule with iron authority. The Assyrians had perfected this approach, creating vast networks of terrified subjects who obeyed through fear rather than loyalty. The Babylonians themselves had employed similar tactics when circumstances required harsh measures against rebellious populations. But Cyrus envisioned something far more sophisticated and enduring, an empire held together not by the sword, but by the voluntary participation of its constituent peoples. The revolutionary document that would emerge from these deliberations began with words that acknowledged Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon, as the divine force that had chosen Cyrus to restore justice and order to the land. This opening phrase alone represented a seismic shift in imperial thinking, for here was a Persian king publicly honoring a foreign god, treating the Babylonian pantheon not as false idols to be destroyed, but as legitimate expressions of divine will worthy of respect and protection. The cylinder that would bear these words took shape in the skilled hands of Babylon's finest craftsmen, the cuneiform script flowing across the clay surface in elegant lines that recorded humanity's first charter of human rights. The religious provisions contained within this remarkable document extended far beyond mere tolerance into active protection and restoration. Cyrus decreed that the statues of gods that previous rulers had removed from their temples would be returned to their proper shrines, their worship restored according to ancient custom. The king commanded that sacred buildings throughout his empire be repaired and maintained at royal expense, ensuring that priests could continue their traditional rituals without interruption or interference. Jewish exiles, who had languished in Babylon since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem, found themselves not only free to return to their homeland, but actively encouraged to rebuild their temple with Persian financial support. The administrative brilliance of these policies became apparent as reports flowed back to the capital from distant provinces of the empire. Local populations who had expected the familiar cycle of oppression and cultural destruction instead discovered Persian governors who spoke their languages, respected their customs, and governed according to established local law wherever possible. Temple complexes from Egypt to Bactria experienced restoration and renewal, their priests offering prayers for Cyrus's health and prosperity, with genuine gratitude rather than grudging compliance. The king's reputation spread along trade routes and diplomatic channels, carrying word of a ruler who protected rather than persecuted, who preserved rather than destroyed. The economic implications of this tolerant approach proved equally revolutionary, as cultural preservation translated directly into commercial prosperity throughout the Persian domains. Babylonian merchants continued to conduct business according to their traditional practices, their contracts and commercial codes remaining valid under Persian rule. Egyptian priests maintained their ancient prerogatives over temple lands and agricultural revenues. Greek cities in Asia Minor found their democratic institutions respected and protected, rather than replaced by Persian autocracy. This continuity of legal and commercial frameworks created an environment of stability that encouraged trade and investment across vast distances. The cylinder's provisions regarding forced labor and deportation represented another dramatic departure from standard imperial practice. Where previous conquerors had routinely enslaved captured populations or relocated them to distant territories, Cyrus explicitly prohibited such practices within his realm. The document proclaimed that all peoples should live in their ancestral homes, worship their traditional gods, and maintain their customary ways of life without fear of arbitrary displacement or cultural annihilation. Former exiles found themselves not merely permitted to return home, but actively assisted in their journeys by Persian administrators who provided transportation, supplies, and protection along dangerous routes. The ripple effects of these policies extended far beyond the immediate political sphere, creating a cultural renaissance that would influence art, literature, and philosophy for centuries to come. Babylonian astronomers continued their observations of celestial movements, contributing to mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would eventually reach Greece and beyond. Egyptian craftsmen maintained their traditional techniques for working with precious metals and stones, their skills enriching the decorative arts throughout the empire. The preservation of diverse cultural traditions created a rich tapestry of human achievement that flourished under Persian protection. The practical wisdom underlying Cyrus's revolutionary approach became increasingly evident as the empire matured and expanded. Rebellions, the constant plague of previous imperial systems, became remarkably rare within Persian territories, largely because local populations had genuine stakes in maintaining the existing order rather than overthrowing it. The enormous costs associated with maintaining large occupation armies in hostile territories were dramatically reduced, freeing resources for infrastructure development, trade promotion, and cultural patronage that further strengthened imperial bonds. As scribes throughout the empire copied and distributed the cylinder's contents, its principles began to influence legal and political thinking far beyond Persian borders. The concept that legitimate rule required respect for subject people's rights and traditions challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of political authority. The document's emphasis on divine approval obtained through just governance rather than military conquest alone introduced new criteria for evaluating royal legitimacy that would resonate through subsequent centuries of political development. The evening shadows lengthened across Babylon as Cyrus contemplated the magnificent city that had yielded to him without violence, its temples intact, its people secure in their ancient ways. The cylinder of tolerance represented more than mere policy. It embodied a vision of human society based on mutual respect rather than domination, on cultural diversity rather than enforced uniformity. In the flickering light of oil lamps that illuminated the palace chambers, the Persian king had authored not merely the administrative code of a successful empire, but a testament to the possibility of governing through justice rather than fear, through preservation rather than destruction. The clay cylinder would survive the fall of dynasties and the rise of new civilizations, carrying its revolutionary message across millennia to inspire future generations seeking to build societies worthy of human dignity and divine approval. The great city that had once commanded the ancient world now existed only in memory, yet its influence rippled outward like waves across the vast expanse of history, touching shores that its builders could never have imagined. Babylon's fall, beneath the gentle conquest of Cyrus the Great, marked not merely the end of one empire, but the beginning of a new understanding of how civilizations might rise, flourish, and transform. The very stones of its ziggurats, weathered by countless seasons, bore witness to truths about power and permanence that would echo through millennia, whispering lessons to pharaohs and Caesars, to caliphs and kings yet unborn. In the aftermath of conquest, as Persian administrators settled into the routines of governance, the administrative innovations that had made Babylon great began their quiet migration across the known world. The sophisticated system of royal roads that Cyrus expanded from existing Babylonian networks stretched like arteries across his growing empire, carrying not just messages and merchants, but ideas about law, mathematics, and statecraft. Clay tablets from Babylonian scribes found their way into Persian archives, their cuneiform characters preserving knowledge of astronomy and agriculture that would later inform Greek philosophers and Roman engineers. The very concept of imperial administration, refined through centuries of Babylonian rule over diverse peoples, became the template for Persian governance, which in turn influenced the Hellenistic kingdoms that would follow Alexander's conquests. The religious tolerance that Cyrus demonstrated in allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem reflected a lesson learned from Babylon's own experience governing a vast, multicultural empire. Where earlier conquerors had sought to impose their gods and customs upon subject peoples, both Babylon and Persia had discovered the wisdom of accommodation, of allowing local traditions to flourish under imperial protection. This revolutionary approach to empire would become the standard for successful long-term rule, adopted by Alexander's successors, refined by Rome, and eventually echoing through history to influence the policies of empires that would arise centuries after Babylon's walls had crumbled to dust. The legal traditions that had flourished in Babylon's courts during its golden age proved equally enduring, their influence spreading far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. The concept of written law, which Hammurabi had established nearly 2,000 years before Babylon's fall, had evolved during the Neo-Babylonian period into sophisticated legal codes that protected property rights, regulated commerce, and established procedures for justice. These principles, absorbed into Persian administration and later transmitted through Greek and Roman law, would eventually form the foundation for legal systems that persist to the modern day. Contract law, banking regulations, and commercial practices that had been perfected in Babylon's bustling markets became the standard for international trade throughout the ancient world. The astronomical observations that Babylonian priests had conducted for centuries from their temple towers left perhaps the most profound scientific legacy of the fallen empire. Their meticulous records of planetary movements, lunar cycles, and stellar positions provided the foundation for mathematical astronomy that would revolutionize human understanding of the cosmos. Greek scholars like Hipparchus and Ptolemy built upon Babylonian observations, creating models of the universe that would guide navigation and calendar making for over a millennium. The zodiac itself, with its 12 constellations marking the sun's apparent path through the heavens, emerged from Babylonian astrology to become a fundamental framework for astronomical observation across cultures. Architecture and urban planning, arts in which Babylon had excelled, spread throughout the Persian Empire and beyond, carrying with them new concepts of monumental construction and city design. The Hanging Gardens, whether they had truly existed or remained a dream of what urban beauty might achieve, inspired generations of rulers to create their own paradises within their capitals. Persian palaces at Persepolis borrowed heavily from Babylonian design principles, while later Hellenistic cities incorporated Babylonian innovations in water management and street layout. The very idea of the capital city as a showcase of imperial power and cultural achievement, perfected in Nebuchadnezzar's renovation of Babylon, became the model for Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople. Literature and learning, which had flourished in Babylon's libraries and schools, continued to influence intellectual development long after the empire's political power had ended. The Epic of Gilgamesh, already ancient when Babylon fell, continued to be copied and studied throughout the Persian period and beyond, its themes of mortality and friendship resonating with new generations of readers. Babylonian mathematical techniques, including the base 60 number system that gave the world the 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle, proved so practical that they survived the fall of every subsequent empire. The tradition of scholarly commentary and textual analysis that Babylonian scribes had developed in their study of ancient Sumerian texts became the foundation for similar practices in Greek, Roman, and later Islamic scholarship. Trade networks that had centered on Babylon for centuries adapted to new political realities, but retained many of the commercial practices and standards that had made the city a mercantile hub. The Babylonian shekel continued to serve as a standard of weight and value long after Babylon itself had ceased to mint coins, while commercial law developed in Babylonian courts provided precedents for resolving disputes between merchants from different cultures. The Persian Empire's adoption of Babylonian administrative practices in managing trade facilitated the flow of goods across unprecedented distances, creating economic connections that would outlast the political structures that created them. Cultural synthesis, the blending of traditions that had characterized Babylon throughout its history, became an even more pronounced feature of the ancient world following the city's incorporation into the Persian Empire. Babylonian artistic motifs appeared in Persian court art, while Persian administrative practices influenced the organization of religious institutions throughout Mesopotamia. This cultural cross-pollination intensified during the Hellenistic period, when Alexander's conquest brought Greek traditions into contact with Persian and Babylonian practices, creating new forms of art, philosophy, and governance that drew from all three traditions. The dream of universal empire that had driven Babylonian kings to expand their borders found new expression in the Persian concept of the King of Kings, ruling over diverse peoples united under a single administration. This vision of ordered diversity, of unity without uniformity, would inspire the Roman Empire's approach to governing its vast territories, and would echo through history in various forms of imperial ideology. The Babylonian model of centralized authority, balanced with local autonomy, provided a template for successful imperial governance that would be studied and adapted by rulers throughout history. As centuries passed and new empires rose and fell, the memory of Babylon acquired an almost mythical quality, becoming synonymous with both the heights of human achievement and the inevitability of imperial decline. Medieval historians wrote of the city's splendor in tones of wonder, while Renaissance scholars sought to recover its lost learning through archaeological investigation. The very name Babylon became a symbol of worldly power and sophistication, invoked by writers and philosophers as they grappled with questions of empire, authority, and human ambition that the great city had embodied in its glory days. The gentle transformation that Cyrus had brought to Babylon, his policy of preservation rather than destruction, established a precedent for enlightened conquest that would influence military and political leaders for generations. The idea that victory need not require the obliteration of the defeated, that conquered cities and peoples might be more valuable as intact contributors to imperial strength than as ruins and slaves, represented a revolutionary approach to empire building. This wisdom, learned perhaps from Babylon's own successful integration of diverse peoples, would become one of the most enduring legacies of the ancient world. The scribes, who had once recorded the daily business of Babylonian merchants and the observations of its astronomers, fell silent as their language gradually faded from common use. Yet their work continued to speak across the centuries through the traditions they had established. In the preservation of knowledge, in the development of law, in the arts of governance and the sciences of observation, Babylon's influence persisted long after its political independence had ended, flowing like an underground river through the foundations of successive civilizations, nourishing growth in forms its original creators could never have anticipated, but always carrying forward the essential spirit of human achievement that had made the great city, for its time, the wonder of the world.